We just never expected something like this to happen. But the doctors have been really wonderful.
Do you want a phone right now? A pause. Just a tiny pause. To us, it may look meaningless. But inside the brain, that pause can represent an enormous amount of activity. The person is processing the question. They may be deciding whether they want the phone. They may be searching for the right response. They may already have the answer forming in their mind. And somewhere inside the brain, neurons are beginning to participate in that process. Then the answer came. Maybe the person says yes. Maybe they say no. Maybe they give a much longer answer. Whatever they say, something remarkable has just happened. An idea that existed privately inside one person's brain has been transformed into language that another human being can hear and understand. And that transformation is the mystery we are going to explore. But inside the speaker's brain, something else was happening. While the answer was coming out, the brain was doing far more than simply moving the mouth. Networks of neurons were processing meaning, context, sentence structure, and the sequence of words. Electrical signals were moving through the cortex. The brain was transforming an internal intention into an external act of communication. And scientists have now developed ways to observe pieces of that process. Hundreds of tiny cells were doing something far more complicated. These cells are neurons, tiny biological structures capable of transmitting electrical and chemical signals. Individually, a neuron is microscopic. But together, billions of them create the activity that allows us to perceive, remember, move, decide, imagine, and speak. The remarkable question is not simply whether the brain is active during speech. We already know it is. The deeper question is this: what information is being represented by individual neurons while language is being created? And scientists could actually watch them, not with ordinary cameras, not by looking at the brain from outside, but by recording electrical activity from individual neurons under rare clinical circumstances. And that opportunity came from people who were already undergoing intensive monitoring because of epilepsy. The story doesn't begin in a neuroscience laboratory. It begins in medicine. It begins with doctors trying to understand a neurological disorder. It begins with patients whose brains needed to be monitored closely so physicians could determine where abnormal electrical activity was occurring. And through that clinical work, science gained an unusual window into the living human brain. It begins with people who came because of epilepsy. Epilepsy can cause abnormal bursts of electrical activity in the brain. For some patients, doctors need extremely detailed recordings to understand where those abnormal signals originate. That can involve electrodes placed on or inside the brain. The purpose is medical. But while those recordings are being made, researchers can sometimes observe what individual neurons are doing while a person is awake and behaving naturally. And that creates an extraordinary scientific opportunity. Their doctors needed to understand what was happening inside their brains. Where were the abnormal signals coming from? Which areas were involved? How did the activity change over time? These are clinical questions. But once researchers could record neural activity with such precision, another question became possible. What else can these recordings tell us about the normal human brain? Especially about something as complicated as language? Somewhere inside this story was a researcher named Jing Chai. Jing Chai and colleagues became interested in the neural machinery underlying human language. But they were not looking for something sensational. They were not simply searching for a mythical cell that could read a person's mind. Their question was much more precise. Kai wasn't looking for a brain cell that could read minds. That distinction matters. Because headlines about neuroscience can sometimes make discoveries sound like science fiction. The researchers were not claiming that one neuron contains an entire thought. They were asking whether individual cells contain measurable information about particular components of language: meaning, grammar, relationships between words, sentence structure, and context. The question was much more precise. What happens inside a neuron when a person creates a sentence? Does the cell respond simply because a particular word appears? Or does its activity reflect something deeper? Could a neuron reflect the relationship between words? Could it respond differently depending on the structure of the sentence? Could individual neurons participate in the construction of meaning? Those questions take us much deeper into the architecture of language. What does one neuron actually do when a human being creates a sentence? Think about that question. Not what does the whole brain do? Not what does a large brain region do? One neuron. What information can be found in the activity of a single cell while a person is actually speaking? Because if we can understand the behavior of individual neurons, we can begin to understand how larger networks create something as complicated as language. So they did something surprisingly simple. They allowed people to communicate. Instead of reducing language to a perfectly controlled laboratory exercise, researchers could study speech as it naturally unfolds. Because real language is messy. People don't always speak in complete sentences. They change their minds. They pause. They use different words. They respond to context. And that natural variability is exactly what makes language so interesting. They talked. That's it. People talked. And underneath that ordinary human behavior, electrodes recorded neural activity. Every word produced an opportunity to compare what the person said with what individual neurons were doing at roughly the same time. The conversation became a kind of experiment, and the brain became the laboratory. Not a script, not a repeated sentence. This matters because memorized or repeated speech can behave differently from spontaneous communication. The researchers wanted to understand language as a living process, a person deciding what to say, selecting words, constructing a sentence, and communicating an idea that another person can understand. That gives scientists a much richer picture of what the brain is actually doing. A real conversation. And real conversation is incredibly complicated. When someone speaks to you, they are not simply delivering words. They are communicating an intention. They are responding to the situation. They are choosing information based on what they think you already know. And your brain has to interpret all of it. And underneath that conversation, the electrodes were recording. Imagine thousands of tiny measurements being collected while a person speaks. Some neurons become more active. Others become less active. Patterns change. And researchers can align those patterns with the words and sentences being produced. This creates two streams of information: the language the person produced and the neural activity occurring while they produced it. The scientific challenge is to determine whether those two streams are connected. One neuron, one tiny cell. A microscopic component of a brain that contains billions of neurons. And yet, that one cell may carry measurable information about what is happening in language. Not necessarily the entire meaning, not necessarily the entire sentence, but some aspect of the linguistic process. Then another. And another neuron may behave differently. One cell might respond strongly in one context. Another might reflect a different linguistic relationship. Another may participate in a broader network. The important discovery is not that one neuron does everything. It is that different neurons can contribute different pieces of information, then hundreds more. Now the picture becomes much larger. Hundreds of neurons, different patterns, different timings, different relationships. And together, those patterns begin to reveal something about how the brain represents language. The brain is not a collection of isolated cells. It is a network, and language emerges from the coordinated activity of that network. Now, the researchers had a problem. They had enormous amounts of data. But data is not automatically understanding. Imagine being given hundreds of recordings containing thousands of electrical signals. How do you determine which patterns correspond to grammar? Which correspond to meaning? Which correspond to sentence structure? Which are simply related to the physical act of speaking? The researchers needed a way to compare neural activity with the structure of language. They had the conversation. They knew what the participant had said. They knew the sequence of words. They knew when each part of the sentence occurred. That gave them the language side of the equation. But they also had something else. And they had the neural activity. Electrical signals recorded directly from individual neurons. Now, the researchers had two timelines. One described what the person was saying. The other described what neurons were doing. The question was whether meaningful relationships could be found between them. The question was whether the two were connected. If a neuron becomes active when a particular word appears, that tells us something. But what if the activity changes depending on the role that word plays in the sentence? What if the same word produces different neural patterns depending on context? Then the neuron may be representing something deeper than the word itself. It may be participating in the representation of language structure. Then they change the sentence. Consider two sentences. They can contain almost exactly the same words, but if the relationship between those words changes, the meaning changes.
The sentence.
That gives scientists a powerful way to investigate whether neurons are sensitive to grammatical structure, rather than simply individual vocabulary items. The boy chased the dog. The boy is performing the action. The dog is receiving the action. Your brain understands this almost immediately. You don't need to consciously analyze the grammar. You simply understand what happened. But your neurons had to somehow represent those relationships. Then they reversed it. The dog chased the boy. Same basic vocabulary. But a completely different situation. The roles have switched, and your brain instantly recognizes the difference. That tells us something important about language. Meaning isn't stored only inside individual words. Meaning emerges from relationships. Almost the same words. Boy, dog, chased. The same basic ingredients. But the arrangement changes. And when the arrangement changes, the meaning changes. So the brain has to keep track of more than vocabulary. It has to understand structure, but a completely different meaning. This is one of the central ideas behind the research. Language is relational. Words interact with other words. The meaning of one part of a sentence can depend on the position and role of another part. And researchers found evidence that individual neurons can reflect aspects of these relationships. Your brain doesn't simply hear the words. When you hear a sentence, your brain is doing much more. It identifies sounds. It recognizes words. It considers context. It determines grammatical relationships. And it builds an interpretation. The brain is not simply receiving language. It is actively constructing meaning. It understands what each word is doing. A word can be a subject, an object, an action, a description, a part of a larger phrase, and the role can change depending on the sentence. Your brain handles this continuously, usually without conscious effort, and some individual neurons appear to reflect those relationships. That is where the discovery becomes particularly interesting. Individual neurons showed activity patterns associated with specific linguistic relationships and structures. Not every neuron does the same thing. Not every neuron represents an entire idea. Instead, different cells appeared to contribute different pieces to a much larger representation, and those pieces work together. But Kai wasn't finished. Understanding what neurons do while a person is producing a sentence is already remarkable. But there was another question. Could neural activity tell researchers something about language before the next word was actually spoken? That takes the investigation one step further. The researchers looked at something that hadn't happened yet. The next word. Before the sound existed outside the brain. Before the mouth had finished producing it. There could already be neural activity associated with what was coming next. This is not magic. It is the brain preparing language. The next word.
Their doctors needed to
Think
understand
about what
was
happens when
happening
you
inside
speak.
their brains.
You don't wait until one word has completely disappeared before deciding what comes next. Language unfolds continuously. The brain is constantly anticipating and preparing upcoming information before it was spoken. That timing is important. The neural process associated with producing language begins before the final sound reaches the outside world. The brain prepares, the body executes, and speech emerges. The sentence wasn't outside the brain yet. There was no sound traveling through the air, no audible word, nothing for another person to hear. But internally, the linguistic process was already underway. But inside the brain, networks were becoming active. The intended message was being processed. Words were being organized. The sentence was taking shape. It was already being constructed. And that may be one of the most fascinating aspects of human language. Speech is not created at the instant we hear it. The brain prepares it. It builds it. It organizes it. And then the physical machinery of speech turns that internal plan into sound. And suddenly, there was a question nobody could ignore. If researchers can identify information about language inside individual neurons, how far could this technology eventually go? Could neural activity reveal what someone is thinking? Could a machine decode language directly from the brain? And perhaps most importantly, where would the scientific possibilities end? If scientists can see information about language inside individual brain cells, then the boundary between neuroscience and technology begins to change. Because neural activity is no longer completely inaccessible. Researchers can measure it, analyze it, model it, and sometimes identify information within it. But identifying information about language is not the same thing as unrestricted thought reading. Can they read your thoughts? Not in the way science fiction imagines. There is no simple machine that can sit beside you and automatically reveal every private thought in your head. These experiments are limited. They require specialized equipment. They involve carefully defined tasks. And the signals themselves are complex. What researchers are discovering is much more precise. They are learning how specific aspects of language are reflected in neural activity, not in the way you might imagine. The real story is actually more interesting than science fiction. Because instead of a machine magically reading everything in someone's mind, scientists are gradually learning the biological language of communication. One component at a time. One neural pattern at a time. This wasn't science fiction. It was experimental neuroscience. Clinical recordings, individual neurons, computational models, and careful analysis. The technology is real. The findings are real. But the capabilities still have significant limits. But what they discovered may be more useful than mind reading. Because imagine what this knowledge could eventually make possible. Not surveillance, not invasion, communication. Helping people whose brains can still generate language, but whose bodies can no longer produce normal speech. That possibility changes the entire meaning of the research. Imagine knowing exactly what you want to say. You know the words. You know the idea. You know what you want another person to understand. But something has happened to your ability to speak. Your mind is still full of information, but your voice can no longer carry it. But being unable to say it. For someone living with severe paralysis or a neurological communication disorder, this can be devastating. The inability to speak does not necessarily mean the absence of thought. A person may still have memories, preferences, emotions, opinions, humor, love, and things they desperately want to communicate. The challenge is finding a new pathway from the brain to another human being. That is where this research could eventually lead. A future where neural signals could help drive communication technologies. The brain produces patterns associated with intended language. Sensors detect those patterns.
That is where this
Computational systems interpret them. And eventually, the system could produce words through a computer or speech device. That future still requires substantial research. But the scientific foundation is becoming clearer. Not to invade someone's mind. That distinction should remain at the center of the conversation. The purpose of medical brain-computer interfaces should be consent-based communication. The technology should serve the person. It should protect their privacy, and it should give them greater control over their ability to communicate. But to help someone communicate. Imagine a person who once struggled to speak, being able to express a complete thought again, to answer a question, to tell a loved one what they need, to participate in a conversation, to make a decision, to say something as simple as, "I am okay," or "I love you." Communication is not merely information. It is human connection. And then we return to that ordinary conversation. The same room, the same participant, the same apparently ordinary interaction. But now we know what might be happening beneath the surface. A question. Someone asks something. The sound enters the listener's ears. The brain processes it. Meaning begins to emerge. And almost immediately, another process starts. The preparation of a response. An answer. The person responds. A few words. Perhaps a sentence. Perhaps something much more complicated. But beneath that answer is a network of biological activity that we are only beginning to understand. And beneath the voice, there is electrical activity, neural networks, individual cells, patterns of communication, language being assembled. The voice is only the visible part of the process. A hidden conversation was already happening. Inside the brain, neurons were communicating with one another. Information was moving through networks. Meaning was being assembled. The sentence was being constructed. And eventually, that hidden conversation became an audible one. We spend our lives speaking without thinking about how extraordinary it is. Think about how many conversations you have every day. Thousands of words, questions, answers, stories, arguments, jokes, instructions, promises, apologies. You do all of this without consciously controlling every neural process involved. The brain makes language feel effortless, but effortless does not mean simple. It means the machinery is incredibly well integrated. A thought appears. Perhaps you suddenly remember something. Perhaps an idea comes to you. Perhaps you want to tell someone something that just happened. Before you speak, there is an internal experience, a thought, an intention, a message you want to communicate. Words form. The brain begins translating that intention into language. Words become available. They are selected. They are arranged. Their relationships are established. And the message becomes more precise. A sentence takes shape. Now the idea has structure. The brain has to organize the sequence. What comes first? What comes next? Which word describes the action? Who is doing what? What does the listener need to know? All of this can happen incredibly quickly. And another human being understands. That may be the most extraordinary part. Your brain constructs a message. Another person's brain reconstructs it. And somehow, despite the enormous complexity between those 2 points, meaning survives the journey. For most of human history, everything happening between those moments was invisible. Humans have spoken for thousands of years. But for most of that history, we had no way to see what individual brain cells were doing while language was being created. We could observe the result. We could hear the voice. We could study behavior. But the cellular machinery remained hidden. Now that is changing. Now, scientists are beginning to see it. Not everything, not the entire process, but pieces, individual neurons, patterns, relationships, timing. And those pieces are helping researchers construct a more detailed picture of how the brain creates language. Not the entire mystery. There is still an enormous amount we don't understand. We don't have a complete neural dictionary. We don't have a universal map of every thought. We don't understand every interaction between every neuron. And we are nowhere near completely explaining consciousness. Not yet. That phrase is important. Because science is not about pretending to know what we don't know. It is about discovering what we can demonstrate, and then asking better questions. And the better our measurements become, the better those questions become. But pieces of it, pieces of the language system, pieces of grammatical processing, pieces of sentence structure, pieces of meaning, pieces of the process that transforms thought into communication. Each discovery adds another piece to the larger picture. One brain cell at a time. One neuron. Then another. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Each one gives us another glimpse into the machinery that makes human language possible. But the story doesn't end here, because understanding the neural signals is only the beginning. The next question is, what can we actually do with this knowledge? And perhaps more importantly, what happens when neuroscience meets artificial intelligence? Because this is where the story becomes even more interesting. For decades, scientists have tried to understand how the brain represents language. At the same time, computer scientists have been building systems capable of processing language. These two fields are now beginning to meet. And that meeting could become extremely important. Imagine you have a recording of hundreds of neurons. Each neuron produces activity that changes over time. The data might look meaningless at first. Thousands of fluctuations, tiny electrical events, patterns that seem impossible for a human being to interpret. But computers are extremely good at detecting patterns in enormous data sets. So researchers can train computational models to search for relationships between neural activity and language. The system might be given information about what a participant said. Then it examines the neural signals. Over many examples, the model can begin to identify statistical relationships. This does not mean the computer suddenly understands the person's entire mind. It means the computer has learned to associate certain patterns of neural activity with particular measurable aspects of language. That distinction is crucial, because it tells us what these systems actually do. They decode patterns. They don't possess supernatural access to thoughts. Brains are not identical. The neural activity associated with one person's speech will not necessarily look exactly like another person's. Their anatomy is different. Their experiences are different. Their language history is different. Their neural organization can differ. That means a system trained on one person may not automatically work perfectly for another. Researchers, therefore, have to solve a difficult problem. How can neural decoding become reliable across individuals? And even within the same individual, neural signals can change. Electrodes can shift. Brain activity can vary. The person can become tired. The context can change. Their speaking behavior can change. So building a reliable communication system is much harder than simply demonstrating that a signal exists. This is where scientific excitement has to meet engineering reality. Finding a neural signal is one thing. Turning it into a dependable medical device is another. A useful system must be accurate. It must be fast. It must be safe. It must be comfortable enough to use. It must work consistently. And it must provide meaningful benefit to the person using it. That can take years of research. It requires engineers, neuroscientists, neurologists, surgeons, computer scientists, speech scientists, ethicists, and, most importantly, patients. Because ultimately, the technology has to work for real human beings. Imagine a person who has spent years unable to speak. Their family has learned to interpret small movements, a look, a gesture, a blink, perhaps a communication board. Now imagine that person being able to generate natural speech again, not because their disease has magically disappeared, but because technology creates a new communication pathway. That could change relationships. It could change healthcare. It could change independence. It could change how a person experiences their own identity. The ability to speak is something most of us barely notice until it is taken away. Then we realize how fundamental it is. But there is another side. As technology becomes better at decoding neural information, society will need strong boundaries. Brain data is deeply personal. We already worry about privacy when it comes to our phones, our messages, our search history, our photographs. Imagine adding neural information to that list. Who gets access? Who stores it? Who can use it? Can a person withdraw consent? Can employers demand it? Can insurance companies access it? Could governments ever misuse it? These questions may sound futuristic, but responsible science asks them before the technology becomes widespread. This is why terminology matters. Mind reading sounds like someone can see everything inside your head. Modern neural decoding is much more limited. Researchers generally need a specific task, a specific signal, a specific participant, a trained model, and a controlled environment. Even then, the system produces an interpretation with uncertainty. It does not magically reveal every thought. Understanding this distinction protects both scientific accuracy and public understanding. And yet, even with all these limitations, the discovery remains profound. Because the brain is physical, the thoughts we experience feel abstract, ideas feel intangible, meaning feels invisible. But underneath those experiences is biological activity. Electrons, ions, membranes, chemical signals, networks, cells. And somehow, from that physical machinery emerges language. A joke, a memory, a question, a story, a confession, a promise, a name. That is the mystery. Right now, you may be hearing this narration. Your ears are receiving sound. Your brain is processing it. Words are being recognized. Meaning is being constructed. You are not consciously calculating every sound. You are not manually assembling every sentence. Your brain does it automatically. And while you listen, you may already be predicting what the narrator is going to say next. That is how powerful language processing is. We don't simply hear sentences. We anticipate them. We interpret them. We connect them with memory. And we build a continuous internal representation of what is being communicated. Perhaps the most amazing part is not that scientists can record neurons. It is that neurons can represent information rich enough to support language. A tiny biological cell, inside a three-dimensional network, inside a human brain, can participate in the construction of a sentence. A sentence that can communicate something that has never existed in the outside world before. You can create a completely new sentence right now. Something you have never said before, and your brain can produce it. That flexibility is extraordinary. Think about what happens when you say, "I have an idea." The idea begins internally. Your brain transforms it into language. Your body produces sound. The sound travels through air. Another person hears it. Their brain reconstructs the meaning. Now the idea exists inside two minds. That is communication. And we perform this process constantly, without thinking about it. The next decade could bring major advances in our understanding of this process. Better electrodes, better neural recording, better artificial intelligence, better language models, better algorithms, better understanding of individual neurons. Together, these technologies could allow researchers to build increasingly sophisticated models of how the brain represents language. But the goal should not simply be technological power. The goal should be human benefit. If neuroscience can help someone communicate, that is meaningful. If it can help someone regain independence, that is meaningful. If it can help us understand neurological disease, that is meaningful. And if it teaches us something fundamental about ourselves, that may be the greatest achievement of all. Return once again to that quiet room. Someone asks a question. There is a pause. Then the answer comes. To an observer, it is ordinary. But now we know that underneath those few seconds is an extraordinary biological process. A question enters one brain. An answer begins forming inside another. Neurons become active. Words are selected. Relationships are constructed. A sentence takes shape. The mouth moves. Sound travels. And another brain understands. For most of human history, everything happening between those moments was invisible. Now, scientists are beginning to see it. Not the entire mystery. Not yet. But pieces of it. Enough pieces to change how we think about language. Enough pieces to suggest new ways of helping people communicate. Enough pieces to reveal that the simple act of speaking is anything but simple. And perhaps one day, the technology will become precise enough to give a voice to someone who has lost theirs. But even then, there will still be a deeper mystery. Because knowing how neurons participate in language does not completely explain what it feels like to have an idea. It does not completely explain consciousness. It does not completely explain identity. It does not completely explain what makes one human being different from another. Those questions
How have you
remain.
been feeling since we
And
started?
perhaps that is exactly
To be
what
honest,
makes
though, I
neuroscience
felt
so
a lot
fascinating.
more grounded.
Every
I think it's
answer
really making a
creates another
difference.
question. Every neuron reveals another layer. Every experiment opens another door. The human brain is not a machine we have finished understanding. It is a world we are still exploring. And now, for the first time, we can begin to watch some of that world from the inside.
Not
A
in the way you
thought
might imagine.
appears. Words form. A sentence takes shape. And another human being understands. All of that. From a network of living cells. One signal, one sentence, one brain cell at a time.